Welcome to She Said Homestead, the podcast that explores homesteading from a range of perspectives. We're Sage and Mickayla, two homesteaders, each with unique experiences, properties, and future goals for our homesteads. We're discussing various homesteading topics, sharing our personal experiences as women working full-time who are managing homesteads as well, and shining a light on the stories of other inspiring homesteaders.
Before we dive in, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you enjoy our podcast, please consider leaving a review. It really helps us grow and share these homesteading stories with even more people.
Hey there, guys. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mickayla from Calico Cow Acres.
And I'm Sage from Terra Nova Acres, and we both have homesteads in Western North Carolina.
Today, we are going to be talking about dairy animals, but first, why don't you tell me about your week, Sage?
My week, I got to do something that I've never done on the homestead before, which is pretty cool, and that is pick fruit. So I started planting itty-bitty fruit trees almost as soon as I got here and knew that I wasn't going to get fruit anytime soon. But one of the peach trees that I have in the back of the garden actually produced this year. It had a lot more peaches on it, but they got ripped off by the hailstorm at the beginning of the season, which was a bummer. But I got to pick 3 whole peaches off of my peach tree, and that was really, really cool. I've eaten 2 of them so far. The third one is almost ripe, so I'll get to eat that one here soon. So that felt very much like a pretty big milestone, even though it's an insignificant amount of fruit. That's really cool. I've waited, 2.5 years to be able to do that. That feels really good.
Were they like the best peaches you've ever tasted?
I grew up in Georgia. I have had tastier peaches, I will say that. But, it's the first fruit that tree has ever produced in its life. So, it's got some practice. They were really, really, really good. But, when you have like one of those really big, like perfectly ripe peaches, which I picked them a little early so the squirrels didn't get to them. It was still very, very good.
I don't know what the pest is, but we had peaches on our sideways peach tree earlier this year, and some sort of worm or whatever got into them, and they ended up dying before they could ripen. But I think we might be able to salvage it next year if we can protect them or put the little party bag things on top of them, the mesh bags. I'm gonna try that next year because that would be really cool.
Peaches are pretty notorious to be difficult to grow organically, and I honestly think that they just haven't found me yet. So I'm sure that's something I'm going to contend with. And I actually have people in my comments being like, how did you grow those without anything added to them? And I was like, I'm going to be really, really honest. I got lucky. This is not skill. This is just chance. But I also pinched my basil back, and so that meant that I made a batch of pesto. So, it's starting to become that season where things are coming in and I'm having to keep on top of, doing something with it, because if I don't, then it gets fed to the chickens or turned into compost. But I have a little bit of pesto in the refrigerator, and I need to make probably 3 more batches to go through all the basil that I picked, which I will freeze. And then after I have enough pesto for the year, then I'll switch over to basil oil once I'm, pulling actual plants out of the garden, not just pinching little nubs off the top. So it's starting to happen, that preservation season, which is cool. And the flowers are also starting to come into production too. So it's the time where I'm trying to go through and make sure that I am picking those flowers when they're ready, and then I'm practicing making bouquets with them. And then with those bouquets that I'm practicing making, I'm just putting them in the stand that I have for my eggs and just giving them away for free to whoever stops by. And I have, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 different flower arrangements already in the house. I'm set on flowers, but that's really fun. And the dahlias are starting to bloom, which is my favorite flower. So I'm really happy and about to be, I acknowledge that I'm about to be overwhelmed with all the food and flowers that I have coming in. But for right now, I'm just kind of enjoying it. The last one is not a super happy one, but my bees absconded from their hive. They got small hive beetle the 1 week that I was like, I don't need to do a hive inspection this week. I've been doing it every week. I'm gonna give them a break. I'm gonna give me a break. And then I cracked open the hive a few days ago, found some small hive beetle, did a little bit of damage control, and then, with the intent to come back in a couple days and really do some things, and they were already gone. So I no longer have bees right now, but that does give me the opportunity to try to catch a swarm, which was my intention to begin with, but I decided to make my life quote unquote easier and just did a package of bees. And I had so many issues with that package. At first, the queen wouldn't lay at all. And then it got to like 3 weeks and I was about to replace her. And then she started laying. And I said, okay, she's laying. I'll leave her. And then it turned out that what she was laying wasn't worker brood. It was all drone brood, which is not sustainable. And so then that happened right as I was going on my business trip. So I couldn't replace her right away. And then once I did get the new queen in there, she was good. But like, they had been through so much up and down and so many stressful situations, and I did not have a second colony or a second hive to, do other mitigation measures that I could have done if I had that material. It's hard to have one hive start with a package instead of a nucleus and be a new beekeeper. So it's like all those things kind of perfectly culminated and they left. But I'll have bees again for sure. Just not those bees.
I was gonna say it's like a perfect storm, but I think it's a perfect swarm.
But
we've been getting a lot of rain. Finally, it's been raining almost every day, like it's supposed to. Our little afternoon thunderstorm. So I appreciate that. The garden finally feels like it's growing again, which I haven't felt like it's been growing all season so far, but it's to the point where I walk out there in the morning, I'm like, oh my gosh, you can tell it rained, like everything's a foot taller, like I really feel like it's actually coming into its own finally, especially the tomatoes and especially the trellises. You can see the growth on those every day, which is really cool. I picked my first watermelon last week, this past week. It wasn't a huge one. I think it was a Charleston Gray, and it was like volleyball sized probably, but like stretched out. And it was actually ripe on the inside. It was like starting to rot a little bit at the bottom. So I was like, I'm just going to pick this and feed it to the birds. But it was ripe on the inside. So I had a few bites of it and then I shared it with them. We have a lot more growing on there though. So I'm not like worried about it. I finally got all of the blight leaves pruned off of my tomatoes from spring. And I got them tied up and trellised, so they're actually looking good. They're growing now. They have more tomatoes on them than they had previously, which was 0. So I'm kind of hoping now with the rain and being tied up, they'll start to do their thing. I don't know if last year was just like a fluke year where everything happened way earlier, but I feel like our gardens are on par with each other more this year time-wise. And last year, I feel like my stuff was done like weeks before yours was like going. Like my tomatoes were done by this time last year and they're just getting going now. I've been feeling like most of this spring summer that I've been behind, but then I was looking at the planting dates recently or like the season, and I'm like, we are literally halfway through. Like my last frost date is end of October, late October, and that's 2 months away still. So I'm like, why am I feeling behind? I have so much time. The flowers are going to grow. The things are going to grow. And if they don't, they'll grow next year, maybe, So I'm feeling a little bit better about everything at this point.
I feel like I have to remind myself every single year that the peak of my garden productivity is in August, because as soon as I plant it in May, I'm like, all right, and go. In May, I have to remind myself that. In June, I have to remind myself that. And especially in July is when I start to get really restless about it. Like, I should be pulling in all of this stuff, and I start to get panicky. But I'm in a very similar place where things are finally starting to grow because we're really getting rain. Things are happy. They're moving out of their just trying to survive stressed space. And I think in Even just a couple weeks from now, both of us are going to be drowning in trying to preserve tomatoes and everything else.
I sure hope so. I will say there are a few things that I'm like, they are definitely more behind than last year. My marigolds, only one of them, I've only had one bloom on any of my marigolds this year so far, which is wild. Like, they're 2 feet tall, but they're not blooming. I don't, they have buds.
That's really weird.
So they just haven't, they've just started opening this week. So I do feel like it could be because I planted things a little bit later. It could be because of the weather, but I'm not questioning it now. Things are growing. I'm happy about that. So moving on to the fall garden, I started direct sowing fall garden seeds this week, which is crazy. I'd finally resowed my carrots, and then I did some cucumbers in those raised beds along the edges of the carrots. So they're the kind that only get like 2 or 3 feet long. I don't remember what they're called, but they'll hang over the edge hopefully so I can get some more cucumbers. And I did a little bit of beets, and I replanted my beans and my edamame again because the deer keep eating them still. They broke like 4 more of my hoops, so I'm just like laying it on the ground now. I guess the last couple things were I got some local potting soil, garden soil, to test out for my fall seedlings to start inside. I'm going to try that. It's called Mater Maker, which it's for all plants, but specifically tomatoes and peppers it's supposed to be. But I'm going to use it I got multiple bags of it so I can use it in the winter to start my next year's seedlings. And I got a bunch of bulk produce from our local farm store this weekend. 80-something ears of corn for $25. 3 35-pound boxes of tomatoes for canning for $10 each. I got some gallons of raw milk, like local raw milk, and I got like 4 pounds of cucumbers to turn into pickles. So I've been processing a lot of stuff this week, and I realized when I started doing that I'm not prepared for the hot kitchen yet. I'm not ready for it. I'm like, wow, I should have just waited. But that's all my corn for the year. Made a dent in the pickles, so I'm not that sad about it.
When you talk about the volume of food that you preserve, it blows my mind every time. I mean, I do it a little bit, but you do it on a whole different level. And granted, you're feeding 2 people, but still, I can't fathom buying that much food and being like, all right, I'm going to preserve this. I would just immediately be overwhelmed.
I am. I am overwhelmed immediately, but that's just my state of being. I feel like I function well with that, I guess, because I keep doing it to myself. So we didn't need that much corn. I was planning to can like 10 jars of corn because I did 40 last year, and it was just a little bit too much. But I couldn't pass up that much corn for $25, and it's organic and it's local. So like, yeah. I'm like, well, I guess we'll have corn for the next 2 years. We'll have to do it next year. Okay. Are we ready to talk about some dairy animals? This makes me want to go get like ice cream to have while we're talking about this.
So let's start off with a few fun facts, maybe things you know, maybe things you don't, about different dairy animals. First and foremost, in order to produce dairy, to make milk, the animals have to be bred.
Another thing is we're all so used to like pasteurized store-bought milk that if you try other varieties of milk, you might be intrigued and or confused at the fact that they taste different. And it's hard to explain how they taste because based on your palate and your taste buds, it's going to taste different to every person.
That is something that's new to me. That's something that I have not heard before. And granted, I have not gone and sampled, milk from multiple different ruminants. I've pretty much just only ever had cow's milk, maybe some goat's cheese, maybe some sheep's cheese in there. But I'm excited to try the sheep milk, and I'm gonna let the first time that I ever have sheep milk be from my sheep, because I'm so close. I might as well just commit to it.
I know what goat's milk tastes like to me, but I was researching what it tastes like to other people to find like the right words to describe it, and everybody describes it differently. It's so funny to read because it's like people arguing with each other about the taste. And I'm like, it's based on your palate, but it's also based on the individual animal and the circumstances and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of variation when you get into small dairy or like home dairy situations.
It can take about 20 to 30 minutes to milk a cow by hand, which is why a lot of people choose to use a milk machine, which only takes about 5 to 7 minutes to milk a cow. But the trade-off is that then you have to clean the machine, which is not only a pain in the butt, but also takes a long time.
I've heard that if you have a few cows, the milking machine's worth it. If you have one cow, it's not. Just for future reference for anybody who's thinking about that.
I've also heard that. And I can see, even if you only have one cow, but you have arthritis or something, or whatever your personal considerations are. Or you just, sometimes you just gotta buy the tool to make your life easier. That's definitely a thing.
Or if you have someone else whose job it is to do the dishes and your job's milking. That might be the key there. That's what
There
I
you
would
go.
for.
Give people ideas.
Yeah. Or kids, like if it's your husband's job, your kid's job. Like, yeah,
There you go. Not my problem.
Yeah, exactly. Domestic goats are one of the oldest domesticated species, dating back approximately 10,000 years. I did not know that before researching this. That's kind of awesome to think about.
Yeah, I wouldn't have ever guessed that either. And the last one that we'll throw you guys today is that sheep are kind of waterproof. Maybe water resistant is the better word. But not only do they have wool, but they also produce something called lanolin, which is kind of waxy, and it helps condition and coat their wool, and it actually repels water.
I feel like that's the best fact we're going to be able to give people today. We could probably just be done now.
Sheep are
That's
waterproof. You're welcome.
Let's get into some more information about these animals. Why do we raise ruminants for milk? They're bigger animals and they produce a lot of milk compared to other mammals. And a lot of these are going to be breeds of these animals that have been bred to produce more milk over time.
Right. I had never really sat down and thought about, all of these animals that we use for dairy are specifically ruminants. At least my understanding of biology is that all mammals will produce milk. And I had just never really put two and two together that, we typically only do it with ruminants. But it makes sense because they are larger animals. I mean, cows are obviously bigger than sheep or goats or anything like that, but they just produce so much milk. And of course, if an animal produces a lot of milk, it makes sense to use it for milk, right?
And just to add in another little fun fact in this, the most milked animals are cows, sheep, goats, and then here's the fun fact part, buffalo and camels.
I don't know, man. I can't picture myself ever milking a buffalo. That seems like a wild experience.
I have nothing else to add to that because I just I can't comprehend trying to milk a buffalo.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm afraid of cows. Oh my god, put me next to a buffalo. No, thank you. And then once we've milked these animals and we have all of this milk, we obviously have to figure out something to do with it. So it would be pretty challenging to just drink it straight. I mean, we'll get into it later, but some of these animals make just insane amounts of milk. And so you almost have to turn them into other products. So that would be things like turning it into yogurt. You can make it into butter. You can do things like cheese, which takes a little bit of skill practice, but it can be done. And then, also fun things like ice cream, cooking and baking with it, turning it into whipped cream, all kinds of stuff.
I know that I personally, whenever we get goat milk goat's milk from the farmer's market, or we just got raw cow's milk from the farm store this weekend, I either make yogurt with it right away, because that makes some really good yogurt, and then I just freeze all the extra and pull it out when I need it. And then I also will always use it as coffee creamer, because I cannot put regular milk from the store in my coffee as cream, but getting it from the farmer's market, like fresh raw milk, it's a completely different experience. It's so good. Those are my favorite ways to use it.
The milk that you get at the store is just so different from what you can get if you have your own animals and you do that, or if you know somebody, a farmer, if you go to the farmer's market. It really is a completely different kind of milk. And so I'm going to say this like 800 times in this episode, but I'm so excited to be able to milk the sheep in the spring and have some milk.
I want to come over and watch you milk or help you milk sometime, just to like experience it, because I've never gotten to be there when something's being milked, which sounds like weird. Like I want to know the process, like in person.
Yeah, I've never been there either, so I'm really just throwing myself in head first. I did look up a YouTube video of how to milk sheep the other day, because I was like, I feel like I should be more prepared for this than I am. But again, that's just how I live my life.
We're really probably giving people confidence to continue listening to this episode. I promise we researched this.
Yeah, I've been researching this for years, and I have sheep, to be fair. I've just never milked it.
So as we're going through all of this, we're going to go topic by topic and kind of compare all of the three animals so that you guys can get an idea of what each one is like versus the others. And I think we're going to start with the main milking breeds. So for cows, the main two milking breeds are going to be Jersey and Holstein. And I think as far as like homesteads go, I see a lot of people with Jerseys in particular.
They kind of seem like the holy grail of dairy cow, because they are able to produce more milk than other cows, but also their milk is a little bit richer. And so it's kind of it seems kind of like a no-brainer, in the same way that a lot of homesteaders raise Cornish cross chickens, because they just grow so fast and they're so efficient with the feed. It kind of feels the same way with Jersey cows. It's like, if you're gonna take the time and the effort and the money and the care to raise a cow, you might as well raise a cow that's going to give you the most milk, unless you can't keep up with it, and I would completely understand.
Yeah, I guess I don't really know a ton about the differences in the breeds, other than I know that the Jersey is super common for homesteads, and then Holstein is the black and white cow that you see, when you think of like a dairy cow. The black and white Holstein is typically what people think of when you think of a cow. And then another one that I've seen a lot is Devons, but I don't really know anything about them. I think they're smaller cows, but that's the extent of my knowledge on Devons.
Yeah, and to be fair, these breeds that we're mentioning, these are not the only breeds that you can have for milk. These are just the most common, and the breeds that, were specifically built around servicing, dairy production. When it comes to sheep, the dairy breeds are primarily East Frisian and Lacan. So East Frisians are the most popular milking breed because they are the heaviest milkers. Different breeds of sheep are going to be more popular in different regions of the world. Where we are, and in Europe, the East Frisian is the most popular milking breed because they're the heaviest milkers, but they wouldn't be well suited to a really, really hot environment. And a difference in sheep versus something like cows is that typically the sheep that are going to be dairy breeds will be considered triple purpose breeds. So that means they're good for milk, they are good for wool, and they are good for meat. Whereas something like a Jersey cow wouldn't be considered great for meat. It might be bred to something like an Angus so that the inevitable offspring that you get once you breed them so that you can get the milk is good for meat. But with sheep, pretty much anything that gives you a decent amount of milk is also going to have other uses if you need them to be more versatile.
And then as far as goats go, There are a lot of common milking breeds, so I think I have a pretty good list here. I'm just going to read them to you, and they are all very different from each other, so it's going to depend on what you're looking for. Sonnens are really big goats. They're going to give you the most milk out of all of these, but then there's Alpine. Some of these are kind of hard to say, so I might mispronounce them. Oberosli, Nubian, La Mancha, Toggenburg, and then lastly, the one that I'm planning on getting is Nigerian dwarfs, and those ones are going to be the smallest ones.
The only ones out of that list that I've ever heard of are Nubian, La Mancha, and Nigerian dwarf, and that's probably just because Roots and Refuge talks about her goats. I think that's the only person that I will willingly listen talk about goats, other than you, Mickayla.
I was going to say, you're about to listen to me talk about goats this whole episode.
And obviously, an important factor when you're talking about dairy animals is how much milk they're actually going to give you, which is going to vary widely between these animals. So, a cow is the biggest physical animal, so it makes sense that it's going to give you the most milk. Cows, on average, give 6 gallons per day, which, when you really sit down and think about that and translate that to what that looks like in a week, 6 times 7 is 42 if I can do math. That's an absurd amount of milk. I mean, you think about the typical volume is, you buy a gallon of milk at the grocery store and that lasts you more or less a week. 42 gallons of milk? I don't even...
a month. 180 gallons a month. I can't even fathom trying to deal with that. Just like, that's on the same level as milking a buffalo for me.
That's a part-time job to keep up with that. Legitimately. That blows my mind a little bit. But that's one of the reasons I don't have a cow is because I could not keep up with that volume. That would be insane for one person.
It would be insane to consume, but it would also be insane to have to deal with it all by yourself.
Yeah, you would have to do something like a herd share or a milk share or whatever way you can do that legally, wherever you are. It's different in every state, but you'd have to share it or give it away or sell it somehow.
Kind of like the different breeds having different characteristics. One of those characteristics of goats in particular is how much milk they're going to give you. Because a Saanen can give you up to 3 gallons of milk a day because, like I said, they are really big goats. And a Nigerian dwarf is going to give you about a half gallon of milk a day. Is a lot more manageable in my opinion. But most of the ones that we mentioned, those main milking breeds, are going to give you around 1.5 to 2 gallons. It's kind of in the middle of those numbers.
And then compare that to sheep, which if you have a dairy breed, you're looking at roughly half a gallon per day. It's going to change depending on when in the milking season you are milking them. Sometimes they're going to give you more than that. Sometimes they're going to give you less. It just depends. But if you don't have specifically a dairy breed of sheep, if you just have a conventional sheep, that's going to be significantly less. It's going to be, like 4 times less milk a day. So in an entire season from a dairy sheep, you're going to get about 100 gallons of milk. And then a conventional sheep, you're going to get maybe 20 gallons of milk in a season.
Let's talk about the types of milk that we get from these animals and some of their differences. Cow's milk is non-homogeneous, which means if you milk it into a bucket and then put it into your jar after it's filtered, it's going to separate. The cream is going to separate from the rest of the milk. So you'll get this cream line and people will scoop that off and you can use that for making butter, you can use it for cream for your coffee, etc.
Which is different than both sheep and goats. For those animals, their milk is homogeneous. It's homogenized. And so you're not going to get that immediate or semi-immediate cream line. Now, that's not to say that if you left it forever, that it's never going to separate. It will eventually. It's just a little bit different. You have to leave it longer for sheep and goats for that cream line to develop, and it's not going to be as stark. When you're looking at a jar of cow's milk. You can see it. You can point to it and say that is cream and that is milk.
Another thing that we need to talk about with this is basically it's the protein structure of the milk. And so you'll hear a lot of the times, especially with cow's milk, you'll hear if it's A1 or A2 or A1, A2, A2, A2. That kind of gets confusing. It is dependent on the genetics specifically of the cow. So you can get that tested before you buy a cow. And a lot of the times people will market them as that because typically A2 cows are the most desirable. And the reason for that is because A2 milk is a lot easier for more people to digest. There's something with the protein structure, like the amino acid chain, that affects how the proteins get broken down while you're digesting it. And some people have a lot harder time digesting A1 milk, but they can still handle A2 milk. I am one of those people. I have a hard time digesting A1 milk. My tummy gets upset when I have like conventional dairy. I've also heard though that raw dairy versus conventional like pasteurized store-bought dairy, that also makes a difference, not just the protein structure.
So with cows, their genetics are going to determine what kind of enzymes, what kind of proteins. With sheep and goats, they are A2 across the board. You don't have to do any genetic testing. You don't have to, quality check that. Their milk is inherently has that A2 protein. So I don't have that sensitivity, at least to my knowledge. That's not what attracts me to sheep's milk. It's not why I have sheep, but it is cool to be able to potentially share it with people who might have that sensitivity and just, wouldn't otherwise have access to that.
As far as the amount of milk that you're getting, cows are definitely going to be the winners because they're the bigger animals. As far as fat and protein go, they are going to have the lowest amounts in their milk. So they will have typically 3% fat, 3% protein. If you're talking about something like a Jersey that are the prime milkers, those are going to be a little bit richer at about 5% fat in the ideal condition.
Right. And then sheep are going to be more like 7% fat, 6% protein. So it's kind of like you just took cow's milk and took some of the water out. So that's richer than cow's milk. It's a little bit richer than goat's milk, and that's why it can be favored in cheese making. It kind of just makes it easier. It makes for less whey, which is your waste product when you're making cheese. You're wanting all the fat, all that good stuff. And you are discarding essentially the water from the milk product when you're making cheese.
As far as goats, the percentages for goats go, the typical goat is going to be 4%-ish fat and 3.5% protein. But with Nigerians, those can be up to 10% fat and up to 10% more protein than any of the other breeds of goats. So there are a lot of specific reasons I'm looking at Nigerians. Size is one of them, but they have a lot of milking benefits as well.
Now let's talk milk flavor, which is also understandably a consideration when you're looking at dairy animals. Cows, I think it's pretty safe to say, would be like the standard. I think most of us have had cow's milk in our lives and know what that tastes like. For most of us, that's going to be, what we find on the shelves in the grocery store, and we just have exposure to it in a way that we don't with sheep or goats or buffalo or camel.
So any of the raw cow's milk that I have personally tried is from a local farm, but they bottle it and then they distribute it around our area to a few stores. And so they're mixing all of their milk together from all of their cows and then obviously distributing it into bottles and whatnot. I have heard that even with raw milk, that flavor is going to be a lot more uniform and more subtle and standard, I guess, than if you were to go milk your own personal cow, which makes sense, right? Because different cows have different conditions that they're in. They're contributing different things to their milk each, and then it kind of all balances out when it's in a big vat. But if you just have the one cow, it is what it is, and you're getting what that cow gives you. So I've actually heard that not only the flavor of that is potentially different, but that can actually cause some like struggles with cheese making, which is not something I ever would have thought about. But if your cow is lacking in something or has issues with some sort of, I don't know, something, that could potentially affect your ability to make certain cheeses well, or like they react differently if you're only having milk from one cow because it's not getting balanced out with all of the other milk from multiple cows. I hope that made sense.
Also, something that I had never considered, in switching from store-bought to, homestead version or farm version. That's just not cases that you're confronted with unless you're doing things like raising your own animals or getting food from people who do. Looking at sheep versus cow milk, since we'll call that the standard. Sheep's milk is going to taste very similar to cow's milk, but because it's, a little bit more condensed, I'll say, it's a little sweeter, but it doesn't necessarily have some of the flavors that a lot of us associate with goat's milk. Even though sheep look more similar to goats than they look to cows, that doesn't necessarily translate. Their milk does taste unique from goat's milk.
I've tried goat's milk a few times now from a couple different sources locally. Obviously not my own. But in my experience, I thought it was really sweet. And I didn't get a lot of the tang that I expected, like you get with like goat cheese. But I have heard, and when I was looking this up, I was trying to get other people's opinions on it because my opinion is different from what I've heard. I hear people say that like sometimes it can be gamey, or it has like a barnyard scent to it, or which translates to flavor because what you smell, you typically are tasting too. And I have heard that. I've also heard that can be due to mismanagement of the milk. Like when you're milking, there are ways to prevent that from happening, which makes sense. Not saying that if that happens, like you're doing something wrong. I don't know how you do milk. I've also heard that having a buck nearby, which is an intact male goat, that could potentially mess with the flavor of the milk because they are just so stinky. Just like having their essence in the air can affect the milk, which kind of weird, kind of gross, but apparently that's a thing.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever been around a buck. They're they're truly gross. Like they pee on their beards just for fun. I couldn't handle it. That's one of the reasons that I was like, goats, not for me.
I personally think the flavor of milk is a very personal and mental thing because you are going to be basing it off of what you know. For a lot of us, that's just like standard pasteurized cow's milk from the store. At least for me, I know that's the most common thing, I feel like. So a lot of us are going to base it off of that. But if you have had sheep's milk your whole life and then you go try goat's milk, you might think it tastes weird, or vice versa. Like I think it's a very mental thing, and I think it's also based on what people tell you. So that's why I want to say like try things for yourself and try and actually give yourself a few exposures to it, maybe from different sources too, because that can kind of give you more of a bearing on it. Don't just try one source and be like, ew, this does not taste like cow's milk. Not for me, going back to the store.
Another difference between these animals is also the length of their milking season. So a cow is going to be able to spend 10 months in milk and 2 months dry. So that's, a whole year cycle. You're going to get milk most of the time from that cow versus a sheep is going to be a very different situation. For your dairy breeds of sheep, their milking season is only going to be about, 120 to 240 days. And to make it even a little bit more complicated with sheep, they are more seasonal than either cows or goats. So they're pretty much going to dry off always at the same time, fall moving into winter. So the length of that season varies because it depends on how early they have their lambs in the spring. If they don't lamb until late May, your season's going to be shorter than if they lambed in early March. So that's where that variation comes in.
I think goats are pretty similar to cows, and I have it written a little bit differently in my notes here, but they need a 60-day period, so basically 2 months off, and they can be 10 months on, just like cows. They need that period to recover and prepare for their next milking cycle, lactation cycle. And something about goats, I'm not sure if this is the same with cows. I think it probably is, but they will keep being in milk for up to 2 years if you don't plan to breed them again right away. They can stay in milk and providing you with milk for up to 2 years without drying off, which honestly, that feels kind of irresponsible to me. I personally don't think I would do that. Knowing the amount of a toll that takes on like an animal's body to do that, I don't think I'd feel comfortable putting an animal in that position, but yeah.
You're a woman. Could you imagine being in milk for 2 years? That would be, I mean, I can't imagine being in milk at all, to be totally honest, but
yeah, I can't really fathom like what being in milk is. That sounds so weird in the first place, but trying to do that for 2 years sounds like a lot. So especially when it's not your decision.
Sounds very tiring. One last thing to add here is that for cows and goats, you can, plan your breeding cycles so that you are in milk all year round. But because of the seasonality of sheep, you can't do that. With sheep, no matter when you try to breed them or what you try to do, there's always going to be a time that you are not in milk if sheep are your dairy animal.
Milking these animals takes a lot of energy from them, which means they eat a lot of food. So next we're going to talk about what they need to maintain that condition to be able to provide you with milk. For the most part, cows are going to eat grass and hay. They will nibble on brambles and forbs, but they're not going to be as interested in those as either sheep or goats will. Milking cows in particular are usually bred to be dependent on some amount of grain. This is going to depend on where you get them from and the breed, but I know for the most part that dairy cows need at least some form of grain because that's what they were raised on. If you get lucky and somehow find a pasture raised cow, they exist, but it's definitely not the most common thing.
Sheep are pretty similar to cows. They are going to eat, mostly grass. They will eat more, forbs and brambles than cows will, but not quite as much as goats will. So they're somewhere in the middle. But, at least before I got sheep, I had this perception that they only eat grass. I did not know that their favorite food is, those deciduous plants, the things with the broad leaves. So they by no means need perfect pasture. They're happy in the woods too. But the same considerations for, breeds that we created to be heavier milkers for us, the same considerations for cows apply to sheep too. We bred these animals with grain supplement. And so, yes, it's possible to find animals that have been raised in pasture systems without grain, but also it's common practice to give them grain. And I think that the real challenge there is finding the healthy balance, because if you give them too much, it absolutely will make them sick, but there's also a possibility that if you don't give them enough, then you're also going to create an issue on the other end of the spectrum. So for someone like me who I won't put any pesticides on my garden, I spend the time to rotate my animals around. For me, when I looked at that and I, did all kinds of research, I came out of that saying, okay, I'm going to feed a little bit of grain. So if that gives you any kind of perspective, great. And if it doesn't, then that's totally fine.
For goats' primary food, they prefer to browse, so they like foraging. They like saplings, briars, privet, honeysuckle, sumac, and the reason I'm getting them, they like kudzu and poison ivy. I feel like if you got all three of these animals, you'd be covered on taking care of your property. Also, for me, goats are particularly beneficial because we have so much that needs to be cleared up and they will enjoy eating all of it. So they need to be out foraging for probably like 6 to 12 hours a day. And that's going to make them the most happy. And then you can supplement with hay and other things as needed.
Something to be aware of if you have ruminants is the things that could be in the pasture, in the forest, wherever you have them, that could be toxic to them. For the most part, I'll say this with a giant asterisk next to it, they should have the instinct to avoid these things, but it is our job as the people who raise and take care of these animals to make sure that we're not putting them at undue risk. So you should be aware that things like buttercups, any sort of nightshade, bracken ferns, English ivy, wild cherry trees, acorns, pokeweed, chokecherry, rhododendron, these sorts of things can be toxic to animals. I have seen my sheep nibble on a little bit of pokeweed. I have seen my sheep nibble on a little bit of ferns, and they're okay. So I don't want to give anybody the idea that if they have an ounce of any of this, that they're doomed. A lot of these things, the animals will choose to eat if they're having some sort of issue. There are a lot of, for example, with sheep, plants that I like to grow in my pasture because if they have it at a low level, it's actually great for helping them fight off parasites. But if they had larger quantities of it, it would cause some issues. So do your research if you're getting animals for dairy, and understand what can hurt them, but also trust them a little bit too.
Some of those plants that we listed, and then there are a bunch more that we didn't list, there are specific parts of those plants that they shouldn't be eating, and others won't really affect them. So a lot of them are like the wilted leaves of this plant can mess with them, or the dried leaves of this plant, or the berry of this plant. So it's like specific things, and they affect them for different reasons, but it's also, like you just said, kind of a level of, it's kind of like an amount of how much they consume. So if it's a little bit, they might get an upset tummy. But again, some of those things, if they were to eat a lot of them, it could kill them.
As far as their other basic needs go, they're all going to be pretty similar, right? They all need salt. They all need mineral. One important thing to note is that sheep are more sensitive to copper. So it's not good practice to give them just general cattle mineral. It should be designed specifically for sheep. It's not that they don't need any copper. They need some copper. It's just they're sensitive to it and they can't have it at the levels that, is designed to be healthy for cows or other animals. So just be aware of that. If you have sheep, you want to get mineral that's specifically designed for them, and that can also sometimes be rolled into the salt blocks. If you're getting the white salt block, that's fine, that's just salt, but the reddish ones are the ones that have extra mineral in it but are marketed as salt blocks. It's also possible that those have higher levels of copper in those than is responsible to give to your sheep.
And they need them in similar proportions to their body size. If you can get minerals formulated specifically for goats, that's better than getting them like the general cow or cattle or whatever, because the goat formulas will provide them in a more concentrated way, and that just helps them get the right amount. So like a salt, like with minerals in it, is not going to be sufficient for goats necessarily.
I looked into doing just a free choice mineral program where you have like each individual thing and they can have exactly what they want. And that's expensive. It's so expensive to buy and stock all of those individually and then create something that they can go to and source all of those without it getting wet. It is such an ordeal. So maybe one day I'll spoil my sheep like that, but not today.
No, it's definitely an option though. Like if you were to want to do that, you could, but definitely not the easy or the cheapest route, probably. And then one more like random need of goats is they're going to need their hooves trimmed like once every month or two. Their hooves grow really quickly.
For sheep, if you're going to trim their hooves, that's generally a yearly maintenance thing, and it is directly related to how much grain you feed them. So if you feed them a lot of grain, you might actually need to trim it more. I trimmed one of my sheep's hooves earlier this year. The others didn't really need it. They were fine.
I thought you were going to say they didn't let you.
Well,
Like-
they weren't fans. They weren't willing participants, but yeah, shearing and hoof trimming was a test for all of us.
So I think it's time we should probably get into pros and cons of these animals because we've kind of got like all the basic information laid out now. So let's start with cows. We kind of already mentioned this, but they give you so much milk. If that is what you're wanting, that is a pro. It could also be considered a con. Another thing about them is they are obviously a much larger animal, which means they're going to have much larger teats, which is their nipples. If you don't know that, which means they are easier to milk.
Right, yeah. And because they're larger animals, their udder sits taller than it does on a sheep or a goat. For a cow, you don't have to invest in, a raised stanchion where you make them climb up and do that whole thing. They just stand there and then you crouch down and you milk them. And I mean, you could do that for a sheep or a goat, but we talked about, all right, it takes maybe like 10-ish, 20-ish minutes to milk a sheep, and I have 3 sheep, so we'll round it to an hour. I can't imagine being crouched down like that for an hour milking. I would throw my back out immediately. So cows are just ergonomic.
To be considered a Nigerian dwarf, like the ADGA certification, I think they have to be like 22 inches or smaller height-wise. Thinking about trying to milk that, like how tiny that is so short. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be using a stand for mine, a stanchion.
Some of the benefits of sheep and why I decided to get sheep for dairy, they're smaller than cows. So, I mean, cows are pretty peaceful animals. Like, they're not going to do anything crazy. A bull might, but a dairy cow is, for the most part, not going to give you too much trouble. But they are still huge animals, and if it's their will against yours, it's at least not going to be a simple fight. And so I like that sheep are smaller, and if I need them to go somewhere, I can, manpower them into doing it. So that was a pretty big consideration for me. And also, I appreciate that sheep can mow down your pasture a little bit more efficiently than cows. Cows graze grass, so they're going to eat your grass, but they're not going to mow it as completely as sheep will, and my sheep will still, eat their favorite patches first and leave some things here or there. But it's not like I have to follow them with a lawnmower. The extent of what I do is I'll knock the seed heads back in the spring when the grass is really growing like crazy and just no one can keep up with it. So it's a lot less management for me. If I had a cow, that would be another weekly chore that I had to do, mow down their previous paddock.
I kind of feel the same way about goats with the fact that they're smaller than the cow. Regardless of the size of goat you get, it's going to be smaller than a cow, obviously. I'm just so happening to want the smaller goats because they're also easier to manage. And the reason that we want goats is because our property is more overgrown, and we specifically want them to kind of like go hard and eat everything that they possibly can and destroy those areas because they need to be cleaned up. And that really helps. That's really going to help us as far as manual labor goes. Like having to clear those areas is really tough. For us, the areas we have to mow, it's a lot easier for Taylor to hop on the lawnmower and mow than it is for us to get into the woods and clear out the poison ivy and kudzu and all of the things that are taking over our property. It really depends on what kind of property you have, which thing is going to work best for you.
Right. So, for example, for me, our properties are different. And so for me, if I were to get goats, they could absolutely help me, mow down some of the brambly stuff that is left over from what I'm trying to convert from forest to more pasture. We'll call it silvopasture. They could do that faster than the sheep would, but they would also eat themselves out of that habitat pretty quickly. And so I could have I could have goats for a couple years and that system would work, but then I would either, have to get rid of them or, in the space that I am able to keep them in, they would end up degrading their own habitat and eating themselves out of their own habitat. So it works great for you. It doesn't work great for me.
Yeah, and you also don't have like the same level of lawnmower that we do, even. Like, you need them to help you mow the lawn, right? Like, it's a lot easier for Taylor to just mow the orchard than it is for him to go out into the sea of poison ivy, because he will just like react to it like crazy. So it really just depends on what you need specifically, like on your land. And we have 8 acres of chaos happening, so the goats will never run out of it. I'm pretty sure that they'll always have something to snack on here. Another thing that I really like about goats is the fact that they'd be taking that forage that they're getting from our property that's just an absolute nuisance for us, and they are efficiently turning that into a product that we can use. So not only are they saving us a bunch of manual labor and time, but they're giving us a product out of that we can use, and like that's super beneficial to us. So with that, we can use it for ourselves, or we could turn that into value-added products like soaps or, like a herd chair if we wanted to get that into it, or, a whole bunch of other things, cheeses, and sell value-added products to bring more income into our property. So I like the potential of that, even if it's not something that we actually like go after. It's cool to have that as a possibility.
And something that's nice about having either sheep or goats is that, usually if you have those animals for dairy, you have more than one. Usually you have at least a few, whereas if you have a cow, you probably only have one cow unless you have a really big family or it's a business for you. So if you have a cow and you have one animal that you're getting your milk from, these are live animals and things do happen despite our best efforts. Animals get sick, animals pass away. And so if something were to happen to your one milk cow and it was no longer there to give you milk, you would be out of milk until you could replace that. Whereas with sheep and goats, if something were to unfortunately happen to one of your animals, you wouldn't be completely out of milk until you replace that.
I think my last pro for goats, personally, is that they are basically puppies. Like, I have said this before, I love dogs. I don't want a dog. I think a goat is going to be my version of a dog. And they can be trained really well. They will come to commands. You can show them a routine and they'll understand and like remember the routine. And they just like bond with you. So I'm excited for that relationship with them too.
One of the ramblings that I got this spring is so friendly. He comes up to me every single time I go out there, and I call him the sweet one because he's just so friendly, and he just wants to say hi so bad. He wants pets and scratches. It's really cute.
I love that. They were so sweet. Like, I know they were babies when we saw them, but they were so sweet. I loved them.
Right, that's what I'm afraid of, is that in 6 months they're just gonna be jerks.
Well, I guess we'll find out.
Puberty, man.
Stay tuned for that update.
It's rough. And of course, it makes sense that if there are pros, that there are cons. So, starting with cows, we talked about this a little bit, but they're just such big animals. And I'm not. So, if it comes down to me versus a cow, there's a solid chance I'm going to lose that. And again, they're generally sweet animals, but it just freaks me out a little bit.
They need a lot of space too.
That's true. Yeah. I have a run-in shed because that's what was here. I don't have a barn and it works great for the sheep. But another thing with cows is they have to be bred to be able to produce milk for you. So that means that you either need a bull, which can be aggressive, or you're looking at doing things like AI, which is not a computer that tells you things like ChatGPT. We're talking about artificial insemination in this case, which is an ordeal. And I'm sure you could learn how to do it yourself. I'm sure you could hire your vet to do it, but it is a whole process.
Speaking of vets, that is something that I have taken into great consideration thinking about our goats, and that's probably one of the reasons we haven't gotten them yet. Because I'm trying to get a savings set up to deal with potential illnesses because we have dealt with so many issues with our birds. I just know that goats are, I mean, all of these animals, but goats and sheep are both prone to parasite issues. And so I want to be ready to deal with that if I need to, like financially. So that is definitely a con for goats, is the potential need for vet care is a little bit higher. And then they just need to be like, you need to keep up on like regularly checking their health and making sure, keeping an eye on them, making sure everything's good.
Sheep definitely have a reputation for being prone to parasite issues, and that is something that I got really nervous about before I got them. I am fortunate enough to, knock on wood, not have had parasite issues so far, but I have the dewormer on hand, and I have, I don't know the word for it, but that like syringe that goes in their mouth. Like I know how to do it, and I have all the tools to do it as soon as I need to do it. Because that's not something that I want to be unprepared for. That goes downhill really fast when you're talking about these animals. Also, especially the milking breeds can be prone to get pneumonia as lambs, and I have absolutely noticed that in at least one of the lambs in both of the seasons that I've had them. So the first season I had the ewes as lambs, and then this season I had the rams as lambs. And it never became a serious health issue in either case, but it has the potential to become a serious health issue. And then if they have pneumonia as lambs, they do tend to not grow as quickly or put on ultimately as much weight or condition as the other lambs. So, it's something that to some extent stays with them their whole life. Sheep are also more challenging to milk by hand just because they have smaller teats than a huge animal like a cow does. So I'm going to have to get really practiced at that. And there's a little bit more technique to milking a sheep than something like a cow. They need more encouragement. If you ever see a lamb nursing, it looks kind of aggressive, like they're just kind of beating up on their mom, but that's how they get the milk to come down. And so when you are trying to milk them and replicate that, you have to kind of beat up on them a little bit to get them to let their milk down. So it's just a little bit more complicated. It's nothing too crazy though.
The last thing that I would say is a con, and it is kind of a huge con for goats, is that they have the potential to need a lot of upfront cost and infrastructure because they are well known as escape artists. And if you can do them in a mobile setup, but you have to train them really well to it, and you have to train them to it quickly, or it has the potential to kill them because they will just try to leave. Like if it shocks them, they go forward. They don't, go backwards. They just try to go through it. And they have the potential to get tangled in it, and that is not going to end well. So mobile setups can be a little bit dangerous for goats in particular, depending on what style you have. Like the nets are kind of dangerous for them. It's a little bit better of an idea to have a stationary zone for them, even if you are planning on moving them around. In case that doesn't go well, you have somewhere to put them. And then just like having a shelter for them and all that kind of stuff. They require a little bit of an investment up front. Minerals, hay, all that kind of stuff.
Right, and a management aspect that's unique to sheep that takes time and effort, and potentially, you might want to hire someone to do it for you, is the shearing. There are breeds of sheep that are called hair varieties that shed that themselves, but anything that's a wool breed or that has, wool versus hair, you're gonna need to shear them. And it takes a lot of patience and practice to be good with it. When you're taking shears to a moving animal, there is also always a risk of potentially nicking their skin, causing, additional potential health issues. So it's something to take into consideration whether you want to shell out the money to hire a professional to do it or whether you are adventurous enough to learn how to do it yourself.
And overall, with all three of these animals, something you're going to want to take into consideration that can happen, and it often does happen, it is a very common issue, is mastitis. We're not going to get into the details of that, but just know that it is something that is pretty common with milking animals, including humans, honestly.
Right. It's something that you want to test for if you have an animal that's prone to it and be prepared to remedy when it arises. You don't want to be caught in the situation having an animal that's in pain and then retroactively trying to figure out what to do. If you have dairy animals, you should have a plan A, B, and C for how to handle that.
I feel like we're going to have to do a follow-up of this episode once you have had some time in the milking stanchion with your sheep and updates on that, like how that's going in the spring. I'm looking forward to that.
I'm looking forward to having the milk. I'm not looking forward to waking up at 4, 5, 6 a.m. when the lambs are super young and separated and milking and doing that whole process. I'm not a morning person, and that's going to be pretty brutal for me.
And to everybody listening, we hope that this was a good starting point as far as dairy animals go for you. And I hope that we were able to give you some ideas for what to research further. But if you are interested in the sort of outline of this podcast episode, we are going to have a free PDF for you to download, and it will be linked in the description below.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of She Said Homestead. We hope you enjoyed our chat. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to hear from you. Send your homesteading stories to us at shesaidhomestead@gmail.com. We can't wait to share them on the air. To stay connected, follow us on Instagram for updates and sneak peeks at what's coming up next.
If you like video podcasts, make sure you subscribe to the She Said Homestead YouTube channel too. We can't thank you enough for being part of the She Said Homestead community. Until next time, happy homesteading.